Hi everyone, welcome to Rush Reality. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, I've been on a bit of a journey lately. I've had that real feeling of nostalgia and wanted to pull out some retro games. So I've dived headfirst into emulation. Now, I've got a few experiences I want to talk you through because I've had a really good time. We're going to kick off with a couple of handheld systems that might be small but are really impressive. Then we're going to kick it up a gear with the Steamdeck for some very powerful handheld gaming. And lastly, we're going to go for the ultimate immersion experience, pulling out the Quest 2 to see just how visually impressive things can get when you put them on a VR headset. Right, so the first device I want to show you is this little thing. This is the Anbernic RG35XX. Now this is really cool. It looks like a little Game Boy. It even feels like a little Game Boy. Very similar form factor. It's got a couple of shoulder buttons on the back, but apart from that, pretty much the design of the old school Game Boy. But this thing isn't running just Game Boy games. We're talking Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Mega Drive, PlayStation, even arcade games. This thing is really, really impressive for its size. And I think the form factor is pretty much perfect for those kind of games. And the user experience is just so good with this kind of machine. It genuinely comes pre-packaged with over 2,000 games built in. Nothing you need to do, all of the ROMs are already in place. Now, I don't know how they manage that legally. I'm sure there are a lot of rules bent or even broken, but I think it's one of those cases where you ask no questions and just take it as a win. The specs of this thing are pretty good. The screen itself is fantastic. It's got a little 3.5-inch IPS screen. I think it's 640 by 480 pixels, so nothing particularly high resolution, but on that small of a screen, it looks absolutely fantastic. So much sharper than loads of these games looked first time round. And the performance is pretty good. This thing's got a quad-core processor. It's not got much RAM, but it doesn't need it for the kind of games you're trying to play. If you push towards the more recent systems on this console, something like the PlayStation 1, things do get a bit challenging, and I have had a few games hit glitches, or often you can tell when it's not quite running right because the sound is kind of crackly or glitchy. But those kind of games are already version on the kind of thing that would just not be comfortable to play on this system anyway. I think this is perfect for the Game Boy, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Mega Drive, those kind of experiences. I absolutely love playing in this thing. It fits in your pocket, it feels really, really well built. All of the buttons are nice and clicky. I love this see-through design. It's really reminiscent of that kind of late 90s design style, really like that. The battery life is around 5 hours, which is plenty of time. You get a really, really good gaming experience on this console. They managed to do all of this for about 60 quid, which is absolutely amazing to me. There are a few challenges. The operating system isn't fantastic. For example, if you click onto the Super Nintendo, I have 1,504 Super Nintendo games on it. I didn't even know there was that many Super Nintendo games. That is quite incredible. But they are in no particular order whatsoever, so you really do need to hunt to find your game. Now, once you've found it, you can add it to your favourites, which does make it a bit faster to jump into next time if you're going to be repeatedly playing the same thing. But if you want to mix it up and play a lot of different games, you're going to be searching quite a bit on this. Because it's an emulation system, it's got save states built in, which is such a comfort upgrade. You can quickly jump to exactly where you were on your previous playthrough, even if this particular game didn't have saving as part of it or made you save at certain checkpoints. All of that is out of the conversation with these kind of features. It even comes with USB-C charging, a headphone port, and a HDMI connector at the top of the unit, so you can play this thing on a monitor or a TV. Now that is really impressive. Now personally, in most situations like that, I'm just more likely to play on my PC than to try and connect this thing up. But it's nice that you could, maybe you're away and the opportunity comes up, why not? It does have sound built in, it's only a small speaker, and it's not very good quality, but you're kind of emulating experiences that never really had great quality audio anyway, so it makes you feel almost at home using it. If you're looking for a cheap and hassle-free way to play some old school games, this thing could well be the choice you should make. Now, with lots of these emulators that use ROM dumps where they just put loads and loads of ROMs on one system, you don't always get the smoothest experience. There definitely isn't any QC before it leaves the factory to check that the games run, and I've seen lots of games that don't run or run poorly. If you're expecting perfection across the board, then you're going to be disappointed. But if you temper your expectations a little bit, you're going to find a lot of very good experiences. But what if you want to spend slightly more to see if you can have a really impressive experience? Well, that's when our next device comes in. That is the Powkiddy RGB20S. This is a really impressive kit. It's a very similar form factor to what you've just seen. It's got those same trigger buttons on the back and those same kind of setup on the front, but you'll notice the addition of two little analog sticks. That opens up the possibilities of gaming past the earlier consoles we were looking at on the previous device. And to enable it to run slightly more powerful games, it's still got a 4-core processor, but it's also got 1 GB of RAM. This thing can run all the same systems that we've seen on the previous device, but you can also throw in PSP, Nintendo DS, Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. Now that's kind of nuts to think that you can play full Nintendo 64 games on a device this small is insane. Now again, like I said with the previous device, temper your expectations with those consoles at that top end because it's not always going to be a perfectly smooth experience. For example, when I was playing on the Nintendo 64, I'd play a game like GoldenEye and not all the assets would load in, but I'd still be able to play it and it'd still be an enjoyable experience. Firing up the Dreamcast, I'm hearing that regular sound stuttering, but turn down the sound and you know what, I can barely tell. Still, some games are better than others and it's just worth trying it to see what it can do. I like the build quality, the buttons on the front are all nice and clicky, the analog sticks are in an awkward place. I don't think there is a good place for analog sticks on a device this small, however you do it's going to be hard to hold, so you need to work out some very specific kind of claw holds to be able to play those games in a comfortable way, but I think you can do it, and I've managed to get in a good couple of hours on some PlayStation 1 games using the analog sticks with no real issue. I don't really like the trigger buttons on the back of this. They protrude slightly more than on the Anbernic, but they really rattle and they're kind of loose. Now I should have mentioned on the Anbernic I actually did something called the tape mod on the directional pad so that it would make sure you get a very, very precise press, because it was prone to catching other directions when you're trying to go in one certain direction. I do wonder if a similar mod could be done to really lock these in place and just reduce some of that rattle, because that moving while you move it around is the only thing that makes this device feel slightly cheaper. Now this is another unit that came preloaded with games. Now you don't always get the same games when you buy these. I opted for the one with the largest SD card in it, and that meant that it came with hopefully the most games. And this actually came with a staggering 21,071 games. That's insane. I genuinely thought that would just be marketing nonsense when I saw that advertised, but that really is the case. You can click through on any of these consoles and there's just insane amounts of games. For example, Sega Mega Drive, 2,933 games. Nintendo DS, 139. Game Boy Advance, 2018. It just goes on and on and on. Each console is packed with experiences. Battery life is very similar to what we saw on the Anbernic, about 4 to 6 hours depending on how high you have the brightness. The screen again looks absolutely fantastic. Same screen size to what was on the previous device. Still IPS, still just as bright, just as vibrant. These games look fantastic. I do prefer the layout of the operating system on this. I like the way that they've got a bit of art next to each choice of console. And when you click through to the game, it still is in that massive order, but there is a search function, you've still got your favourites, and it all just looks a little bit prettier. But the operating system does have some of its own quirks. If you touch the power button to turn it off, it looks like it's off, it loads a goodbye message, you think it's gone, it's all gone black, but it's really draining your battery. And in fact, the only way to really turn it off is to hold down the off button for 10 seconds, and then there's a very small LED down here that turns off, and then you're good. Now I should say that both the Powkiddy and the Anbernic have custom firmwares that you can load onto it. They're made by the community and are supposed to really elevate the experience, but I wasn't that distressed by the experience and I quite enjoyed these being plug in and play, jump in and just enjoy playing these really cool games. So there we have two great experiences, but those are for playing your really old school game. What if you wanted to run all your games that aren't current gen right up to the really recent, really impressive stuff? Well, that is where the Steamdeck comes in. Now the Steamdeck emulation experience is absolutely fantastic and it's got so much easier over the last year. There's an app called EmuVR, which is almost down to a one-click process to load up a really impressive emulation system on your console. When it's all built in, it uses RetroArch through Emulation Station to play all sorts of games, including GameCube, you've got your old school Super Nintendos, N64s, PlayStation, PlayStation P, even Nintendo Wii and Nintendo Switch can be built onto this thing. And of course, the screen looks fantastic. It's very, very comfortable to hold. All of the buttons are in exactly the right places. You can play for hours and hours on this thing without ever getting tired. It's set out really well. I love this menu screen where you can just click through each different console and you get a really, really good image, a representation of how many games you've got running on there. Really, really impressive. It's got all of those comfort upgrades that we spoke about earlier, but it's got none of those little niggly OS problems because this has been designed fantastically. There's been numerous updates. In fact, I probably need to update this again, but I've just had no issues whatsoever. Now the Steam Deck itself doesn't get fantastic battery life, so you're not going to be able to play as long as you would be on some of those older systems. But if you know how to manage it, you can really make the most of that. If you ensure that you're using the right brightness, if you cap your frame rate, I often used to cap it around 45 frames per second on some games that didn't need that higher frame rate, and I would get a really smooth experience. It's really not tasking on the CPU to run most of these games, so it's not going to be pulling as much power as it is on a standard PC game. Everything just looks so sharp, it's so enjoyable to play with, but it does require a lot more tinkering than the previous two options. This doesn't come loaded with any games whatsoever, so you're going to need to load up your own ROMs. Now you might already have a collection of ROMs. I've already got a collection on my PC that's built up over the years, but if you haven't, then you're going to need to go and find some yourself. Now I'm not going to tell you where to go and find those because that's where things can get a bit dodgy, but Google is your friend. The designs are fantastic so that they can make sure you get the correct aspect ratio for when you're playing the games. You'll have these little frames that look like the console you're playing on. So for example here I've got Super Mario World, and you can see you've got that kind of housing from the Super Nintendo around it. It looks so cool to play, and it means that nothing is stretched badly or looks wrong on your screen. So that is your handheld emulation. But what if you really want to tickle that nostalgia bone? Well, then you need the ultimate immersion, and that is where the Quest 2 comes in. Now the Quest 2 can be an emulation monster. The best experience I've had with it is on Emu VR. Now Emu VR requires a connection to a PC. It doesn't need to be a particularly powerful PC because we don't need to focus on running high-end recent games. We're going to run the kind of retro systems we've seen earlier, but we're going to do it in a really, really cool way. Now EmuVR loads you back into your teenage bedroom with a CRT and all your old school consoles placed around the room, and they do it so well. I just get such a warm feeling in my stomach as soon as I power this thing up. This will be your most involved one to set up. There's quite a few steps to get EmuVR loaded properly onto your console, and again you're going to need to source those ROMs yourself. But once you've done that, the experience is amazing. What you will do is you will load those ROMs into your room, and you'll do that by loading the actual cartridges into your room. You'll then pick up that cartridge and put it into the console. You'll connect the console to the TV and you will fire it up. It is awesome. You really feel like you're playing on an old school CRT TV. Now because you're playing on a Quest 2 and the actual screen you're looking at is only a small portion of that screen, the content isn't going to be of the highest quality, but the experience is kind of amazing. Now there's a number of ways you can play here. You can pick things up directly with your hands, you can play with your VR controllers, you can even connect a controller to the PC and play as if you're playing on a gamepad. And I think different systems are better suited to a different method of interaction. For example, if you're playing a PlayStation or a Nintendo 64 game, then it's quite enjoyable to play on your VR controller. You can relax your hands down by your sides. All of the buttons are nicely placed on each hand where they could be. But if you're going for a real old school gaming experience, something like Mario or Sonic, then you're going to need a tactile directional pad that you don't have on the VR controllers. I'd connect something like a PlayStation controller or an Xbox controller. Or if you want to go whole hog, you can buy something like the 8-bit Do retro controller that will really make you feel like you're playing an old school console. The immersion level is insane here. You really feel like as you pick up that cartridge, you're going to need to blow on it to make sure it works before you put it in your console. Scattered around your room, you've got pizza boxes and old style chocolate bars. It looks so cool. I'm telling you, if you haven't jumped into EmuVR, this is one of the most fun things you can do on a VR headset. You're gonna love this. You can really deck your room out. You can apply custom artwork to the front of each game. You can stick posters up around your room. You can even design the bed to set it up just like it was your teenage bedroom back in the past. Now, I haven't really done that myself yet because I was more concerned with jumping into the games and having a bit of fun, but I have seen some awesome setups from other people on EmuVR, so you really can do some impressive stuff. So there you have it. Those are some awesome ways to emulate your old retro games, starting off with some affordable but impressive handheld consoles, onto the Steam Deck for some really powerful stuff, and then onto the Quest 2 for that ultimate immersion. Now if you enjoyed that video, a like would be appreciated and a sub to the channel would be amazing. I'd love to see you next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.